Now, what I'm going to do now is just share about Peter, because when I gave that talk on how the gospel spreads across cultures in Acts, I deliberately didn't talk about Peter because I couldn't have fitted it in the amount of time I had. So I'm just going to quickly take you through Peter so you can see of another example. If you think about Peter, now we're talking about the Apostle Peter, right, in the book of Acts. He's a Galilean Jew, right? So culturally, he weren't up there with the Jerusalem Jews, yeah? But neither is he down there with the Hellenistic Jews. So there's a bigger gap between Peter and the Gentiles than between Philip and the Gentiles. But the book of Acts shows God cleverly working in Peter's life, bringing him to the place where he can share the gospel across a cultural gap. So the gospel can spread from a Jew to a Gentile. So it does happen. Don't misread the talk I did as saying the gospel, that if you're from a different culture, you can't share the gospel across that culture. You can. But let's see what God does with Peter so that is possible. First off, is down here is point 2. Great Commission. Peter and his crew are told to make disciples of all nations. Matthew 28:18. That is quite deep because Peter's a Jew. And he's told, go and make disciples of all nations. So right there, he's told to be a cross-cultural missionary. Yeah. Point 3. Peter's in Jerusalem and he stays in Jerusalem, okay? And he's ministering to various types of Jews. We know there are all kinds of different Jews in Jerusalem, Hellenistic Jews and that. So he's ministering to them, but he's staying in Jerusalem and he's not really sharing the gospel across to Gentiles at this stage. Then you've got the whole Samaria experience, yeah, point 4. The whole Samaria experience where Philip goes to Samaria, and then Peter comes up later and he witnesses what the Holy Spirit has been doing in Samaria. That must have been quite a mind-changing event for him, right? Suddenly seeing all these Samaritans, yeah. We had a life-changing experience on Monday. We went to Birmingham and we went to a Punjabi church, and that was a life-changing experience for me. Punjabi Christians, they're on some next level. Like, I've never met more hospitable Christians in my life, more friendly. I haven't met a guy who was like hardcore Hindu guy, like hardcore, you know, and his wife become a Christian, secretly went to church and that, you know, she kept sharing the gospel with him. He got saved. And all I know is I met this really friendly guy. And it's like, this guy's so friendly. It's like meeting Jesus, sort of, you know. And then afterwards, I find out he was this hardcore Hindu guy before, you know. And I'm like, really? It's a mind-changing thing.
Did they have sitars in worship?
No, the worship was actually pre-played music, pre-played beats, a bit like at our church, although without the boom bap. But there were people praying in Punjabi, you know, and I was just like, wow, it's wonderful to see how God's at work amongst Punjabi people, and you know, and to see how they seem so much more Christ-like than me and my culture who've become Christians. So Peter would have had one of these experiences in Samaria, but would have gone even deeper because I already knew that there were Christian Punjabis, yeah. Whereas for Peter, the idea of a Christian Samaritan, you know, would be like, ooh. And so he obviously saw something in Jesus' ministry of it, but for how long they stayed in Jerusalem, they obviously weren't thinking too tough about Samaritans getting converted. But he witnesses this in Samaria, and then on his way back home, he preaches through the Samaritan villages in Acts 8:25. So we see him preaching to Samaritans. What's interesting as well is he leaves the Samaritans to do the rest of the work. So he doesn't say, listen, guys, you're Samaritans. You're going to need a lot of help, yeah? Because, you know, your doctrine is already pretty off-key. And so what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to stay in your town and help you guys out. No, instead, he just travels back home, leaves them to it. Then Peter moves to what place? Joppa. He moves to Joppa, right? Now, this is interesting. Acts 9:43 shows us that he stays with a what? A tanner. Yeah, so a tanner is a guy who's dealing with the skins of dead animals. Okay, a taxidermist. So here you've got a guy, right, who is touching dead animals and the skin of them, yeah? So this, for Jewish culture, this is not clean. This is not clean. It's like, why are you doing that? So the same way that some of you now, if you heard someone was a taxidermist, you'd be like, ooh, that's kind of gross. You know, and if that's what they did for a living and then they said, would you like to come around for dinner? And that, you know, you'd just be checking if they washed their hands, you know, before they started. You know, they said, would you like a cup of tea? You'd be like, no, I'll get it myself. You know, but for Jews it'd be even bigger because there's a spiritual uncleanness here, you know. And so Peter has now moved to a place and into a house where he is further away from that Jewish Hebrew culture that he would have experienced a lot of in Jerusalem. He would be seen as unclean now. But because he's outside of Jerusalem, that's not seen as so important. If you're in Jerusalem, then that's like, rah. But because he's out in the outskirts in Joppa, it wouldn't seem as big a deal for him to be unclean as it would in Jerusalem. So you see how God is moving Peter away from a certain cultural environment because of what's going to happen next, right? God gives him a vision in Acts 10, verses 9 to 16. He gives him a vision on the rooftop, yeah, that makes him less ethnocentric. Now, today, later, we will come on to, when we look at mission lessons from Paul, we look at what it means to be ethnocentric. Ethnocentric is when you judge other cultures based on your own culture. Here's the bad news. We're all ethnocentric. Yeah, so none of us can be like, oh yeah, I know about them people, but not me. Like, we are all ethnocentric. You just have to admit that, like, that you are ethnocentric. Everyone's ethnocentric. So God gives Peter a vision that makes him less ethnocentric and more open to Gentile culture. So he gets this vision of eating unclean food that Gentiles would eat, and God tells him, don't call it unclean, what I've called clean. God is moving Peter away from the way he sees life. His lenses of his culture say that's unclean. God's moving him away from that, setting him up for what's going to happen next. So point 6 now, Caesarea and Cornelius. Peter is sent by God to Cornelius, a Roman soldier. Okay, this guy, not only is he a Gentile from a totally different culture, yeah, but he's a soldier, so he's the occupier. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we can properly get this in the UK, but maybe if you were from Northern Ireland and you were Catholic, this might be something you could understand a bit better about if there was a soldier from the parachute regiment and then, you know, you ended up going around their house. You see what I mean? Like, so Peter sent to Cornelius, but notice Cornelius is a God-fearer, according to the book of Acts. But that means he's not a convert, he's a God-fearer. So that means he's a Gentile, yeah, he hasn't got circumcised, but he does worship God in some way. So you see, there's this big cultural gap between Jews and Gentiles, but you can see how God's been moving Peter closer to Gentile culture. But you see how he's been moving Cornelius closer to Jewish culture. Can you see that? How God's moving them both together. I just think it's beautiful. Okay, next point. Cornelius and his friends in Acts 10:24, they hear the message, and in verse 44, you see they believe. So notice they have to hear the message. I hope you got that in the talk I gave. Like, you can do all the cultural analysis and everything in the world. If we ain't sharing the gospel, then we're just anthropologists. Yeah, and no one's going to get saved that way. Okay, so they hear the message and believe. The big cultural gap between Peter and Cornelius is overcome, and now the gospel can easily flow to Cornelius's friends and his relatives, and I imagine there would be like slaves in the household. And here, there is possibly no cultural gap. So the gospel now will go from Cornelius to his friends and family where there's no cultural gap. Maybe with his slaves, there would be some cultural gap. So you see, the gospel is moving incrementally. Next point, the circumcised believers who are with Peter, they witness all of this, and they're astonished in Acts 10:45. So perhaps God is preparing them too, and God is starting to move them closer to Gentile culture so that they can start reaching out to the Gentiles. Any questions on that? I just wanted to give you another example from the book of Acts, in between Acts 1 and Acts 11, to show this principle of God basically spreading the gospel across small incremental gaps, and in this case, moving a cross-cultural guy, moving him closer to the culture he's trying to reach, and moving the guy in the receptor culture, the culture that's going to receive the gospel, moving that guy closer so that the gap is smaller, and then it goes to Cornelius, and Cornelius can spread it to people who there isn't so much of a gap.